When a romance ends, it's best to go your separate ways. But some women can't move on. A clingy ex takes out the competition.
It was one of the most sensational crimes of the century.
A wronged beauty wants revenge.
In her mind, she was defending her honor.
And a woman scorned targets an innocent.
Rena's mind was a Disneyland of emotions. Love triangles can be dangerous.
Who was that?
Oh, just a customer.
For some people, jealousy can become an obsessive trait. In this case, it was deadly.
Salt Lake City, 1956. Jean Sinclair is an independent woman.
Being the owner of a nursing home, she was in charge, and I think she was a person who liked to be in charge.
Hi, King.
Oh, hi, King.
Hi, King.
Good morning, subjects.
Jean's no princess. She's king of her castle.
This is Nancy. This is
She was
everybody
called
here.
the king primarily because whatever she wanted, she usually got.
Now these are our resident card sharks.
Despite her appearance, which in those days would be considered odd and perhaps scandalous, Jean did just fine. People trusted her.
They do call me King, but Jean is just fine.
Jean's kind of type A personality actually fed her business sense. She was a hardcore businesswoman.
This is our on-site beauty salon. Lorraine here will have you looking $1 million.
Oh, you're too kind.
Jean's never married.
Lorraine, this is
She devotes
Nancy.
her life to her work. She has a special affection for in-house beautician Lorraine Peterson.
Lorraine was this bubbly person, a beautiful person. Pretty, she's divorced, and Jean takes a liking to her.
Oh, you should have.
And it was love at first sight.
Anything for my special lady.
In 1950s America, it's a forbidden love.
If it would have been public, it would have been very scandalous. In fact, it would have ruined their business.
Maybe that was part of the thrill for Lorraine and Jean, that they were keeping it secret. Maybe that brought passion into the relationship. So for 6 years, this relationship goes on. And most of the time, they meet at this secret motel, and they love each other.
Have a great day. I'll see you next week, okay? I know.
Jean's devotion never wavers. She's there when Lorraine needs her most.
What's up, beautiful?
I'm not gonna make rent this month.
Jean helped Lorraine out financially quite a bit.
Jean says, no problem. She writes a check. I'll help you out.
What would I do without you?
You're welcome.
Stop it. I'm at work.
But Lorraine is keeping secrets.
I can't tell you that. I'll tell you later.
Where Lorraine, I think her sexuality was more fluid.
Stop it.
I think she was more bisexual.
Lorraine decided she wanted to be involved with men again.
I'll tell you later.
Maybe the secretive nature of it was too much.
No, you hang up.
Maybe she explored her homosexuality and didn't want it anymore.
3 o'clock on Friday. See you then.
Who was that?
Just a customer.
You know, here's Jean. She's helping Lorraine with her payments. She's buying her gifts. They're working together. And Lorraine comes and says, I want to see men now. Jean did not take it very well.
You have to leave.
I'm sorry I ever met you.
Jean soon realizes she can't live without Lorraine.
Dearest one, I love you with all of me. I didn't mean it for a minute.
An outpouring of her affection for Lorraine, saying, I love you. I want what's best for you. I don't care what you do with other people. I just want you back.
But she's now competing with a man for Lorraine's affection. 32-year-old Donald Foster.
Don is like everything that Lorraine is looking for, really. He's a good man, and he's a charming man. And their relationship develops to the point where Lorraine and Don get engaged.
It's heartbreaking news for Jean.
Most people experience that pain and hurt, they let it go, and they move on. Not Jean. Jean is not going to let this go.
I mean, what part of her getting married doesn't she understand?
When Lorraine became engaged to Donald, Jean went a little nuts trying to break up that relationship.
It's the early 1960s in Salt Lake City. Jean Sinclair has lost the love of her life, Lorraine Peterson, to a man. She wants her back.
Hello?
Lorraine, it's me.
How are you?
I'm fine.
I was thinking we could have a drink tonight.
Jean calls Lorraine, and she says, hey, how you doing? Talk a little bit. She's nice. What are you guys doing tonight?
The happy couple already have plans.
We can't. Sorry, we're actually going to a movie.
Lorraine says, oh, we're going out to dinner and then to a movie. Tells Jean exactly where they're going.
Maybe she has moved on.
Lorraine couldn't be more wrong.
And that's when Jean went into murder mode.
Jean drives to the parking lot. Because the cars are so close together, she has to squeeze in between them. And at even one point, she's on the ground. Crawling, creeping, like a hired killer.
What is it?
I just keep thinking about that guy in the movie.
It was a scream.
At this point, Jean is past the point of no return. She has to kill him now. She can't go back. She takes that double-barrel shotgun and points it directly into Don's face. And she pulls the trigger.
After eliminating her competition, Jean flees into the night before Lorraine is out of the car.
Oh God, she's killed him!
Lorraine starts screaming, and she actually screams, "She killed him."
She knew in her heart what had happened.
I just can't imagine her pain, her hurt. You know, Jean says she loved her. And what did she do? She took away the person that she loved.
But Jean believes she's cleared the way for true love.
If I get rid of Don, Lorraine will come running back into my arms. This is like the delusional thinking of a psychopath.
Lorraine is in no doubt who killed her fiancé. The police soon find out about the affair, and they come calling to Jean.
Take a seat.
I'll stand. I can't imagine this will take long.
There was no other person who could have killed Don Foster.
When the police find her clothes, the game is over.
Those clothes, they're all covered in grease and dirt and remnants of a crime scene, really. There's probably a lot of gunpowder residue somewhere on there, too.
Jean's arrest captivates the nation.
A case like this was scandalous. It was headline news every day.
A woman who leaves her lesbian lover to go get engaged to a man, and that woman then kills the man. It was one of the most sensational crimes of the century, if you will.
In 1963, Jean Sinclair is convicted of first-degree murder. She is sentenced to life in prison.
For many people in the grip of a jealous rage, the only way to stop the pain they're in is to kill the source of the pain. Sometimes it's their lover, sometimes it's the other innocent party.
10 years later, Jean dies behind bars after suffering a stroke at the age of 56.
During the trial, the prosecutor said to the jury, "The love between women is a jealous love, and hell hath no fury." It was very sexist and very correct. In those days, the most important thing a young woman had was her virtue. And she had given it up for a man that had lied to get her in bed. She went nuts.
In 1861, Las Vegas, New Mexico on the Santa Fe Trail is thriving. And 19-year-old Paula Angel is the toast of the town.
She was conquistador background, very beautiful, long, dark hair, dark eyes, and alabaster skin.
Paula was the it girl. She was beautiful, she was from a prominent family, and she had a lot of suitors.
But none of them meets the approval of Paula's mother.
Paula, give the man a time of day.
She at least had the currency of her beauty.
Juan Miguel was also from a wealthy and politically prominent family in nearby San.
You had nothing.
Paula had no experience with a one-on-one intimate relationship with a man. She thought all men were like her dad, honorable. She was wrong. Despite his pedigree, Juan Miguel loved to walk on the wild side. He liked the ladies of the night.
That's extra handsome.
He hung out with prostitutes.
You're worth every penny.
He went to some of the cantinas on the shadier side of town.
Lying was very easy for him. And Paula was just a next notch on his belt.
Juan Miguel's carousing is hot gossip in Vegas.
What have you heard?
Word soon gets back to Paula.
They were both well known in their communities, and everybody was whispering behind their back.
Paula's just crushed. She thought that this was for real. She thought she was being courted for marriage, and he's being unfaithful in such a public way.
It was time for the big confrontation.
Las Vegas, New Mexico, 1861. 19-year-old Paula Angel has been betrayed and humiliated by the man she loves, 22-year-old Juan Miguel Martin.
Hello, my beauty.
Your fine words mean nothing. I know about your whore.
It's just talk.
Despite the fact that Paula had found out that Juan Miguel was catting around in the whorehouses, she still wanted to marry him.
He's taken her virginity. Only marriage can save her reputation.
You're the only one for me.
He knew exactly what he was doing. He was a player.
How can I believe you?
He's not ready to let her go yet. He wants this to be his call. This was a huge ego thing for him.
Tomorrow, I'll see the priest for our wedding.
He promised to see the priest with her the next day. But that was never his intention.
I miss you so much.
I have missed you too. I hope the children still recognize you.
What Paula didn't know about Juan
Hello, my beautiful.
was that he was a 22-year-old married guy with 5 kids.
He said he'd be back. He promised.
She finally figured it out. She'd been played.
Forget about him. He doesn't deserve you.
I'm ruined.
In those days, the most important thing a young woman had was her virtue, and she had given it up for a man that had lied to get her in bed. She went nuts.
Dressed in her finery, Paula heads for the bad side of town.
The reason she looked so fabulous is she wanted Juan Miguel to see what he was going to miss out on.
I think there was still just a little corner of her that hoped that this would all go away, that somehow it would be made right.
Let us speak the truth. Will you honor your promise of marriage?
So here are these two people from the most prominent families in town, outside of a saloon in a very bad area, and they're having an argument for everyone to see.
I'm certainly not taking a plaything like you to my family.
He told her in no uncertain terms that he had no intentions of ever marrying her.
Juan Miguel leans in and says,
"You little fool."
Big mistake.
Even a sweet girl like Paula can be pushed too far.
She took the knife that she had for protection and plunged it into his back.
He turns around to look at her, and she plunges the knife in again, and this time it's up under his ribs.
And as Juan Miguel bent over in pain, she did the final fatal blow to the back.
Paula makes no attempt to escape.
In her mind, she was defending her honor.
In the Old West, a scorned woman sometimes received leniency, but not when the victim is from a powerful family.
Juan Miguel's family went to extreme lengths to see to it that Paula was convicted of murder. They hired a sleazy, dishonest lawyer, and they bought the judge.
In March 1861, Paula Angel is found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to hang. But her misfortune doesn't end here. Her custodian, Sheriff Herrera, decides to make her final days hell.
Paula Angel! You have only 12 days to live.
The sheriff had a party with her emotions, teasing her, telling her every day, well, you've got 19 days left to live.
You only have a few days to live.
He was horrible, and he enjoyed it.
She was becoming so nervous and so frail that they were afraid that she wouldn't survive to be executed.
Paula survives long enough to become the town's entertainment.
People used to make a day of it. You bring the kids, you bring the family dog, you come out with a picnic basket and you watch the hanging.
Yeah, here.
When they brought her out, she was so gaunt and so frail. They were just gasped from all around the people. Her mother was just devastated.
Breaking protocol, the vindictive sheriff doesn't tie Paula's hands. It's a terrible mistake as she struggles to free herself.
You forgot to tie her hands.
Didn't tie her hands? What's wrong with you?
While she was kicking with her hands around her neck, trying to loosen up the noose, the sheriff came over and started pulling on her legs to make sure that she was going to have the full effect of the hanging. And when this didn't work, people in the crowd became enraged.
Go get the carrots, get the carrots. Go, 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 go.
It's Paula's chance to go free.
There is an unwritten law in the Old West that if someone is hanged and they survive the hanging, that's it. They can walk away. It's considered an act of God.
But Paula is too weak to run. Again breaking protocol, the sheriff strings her up. Paula Angel dies on a sunny April day in 1861.
In the vast majority of cases where someone loses their temper, it's known as a crime of passion. Other women in the similar circumstances in the 19th century walked out of court, but Paula got hammered.
The rumor is that the cottonwood tree, where Paula was hanged, when the leaves change color, they don't turn to gold, they turn to blood red.
We're not happy, Rena. You know this, so do the kids.
Staying in a loveless marriage because there's so much money is a good way to get trapped. And what happens to people when they feel trapped? Nothing good.
Berkshire, England, 1998. Rena and Paul Salmon have it all. A beautiful home.
Guess you little monkeys.
2 children. And money in the bank, thanks to Paul's successful IT consulting business.
Rena and Paul had a wonderful life financially. Rena would fly to New York to shop for clothes, everything.
The life that Rena seemed to have was really a charade.
Paul's often away on business, leaving Rena alone.
Despite the fact that life was good, Paul was making good money, they lived in a beautiful home, Rena started suffering from depression.
She was suffering from appalling back pains, which brought about severe depression. She was binge eating, and she had a host of other ailments.
She would drink too much on occasion. She was very unhappy. She would take antidepressants. Certainly her mental health was very...
I thought things were getting better.
Well, how can they be when you're never here?
I'm working for us, okay, and the children.
Rena and Paul's relationship was falling apart for a long time.
You wouldn't leave me! You wouldn't dare!
Rena turns to her new friend, Lorna.
Is everything all right, love? Honestly, no. It's Paul.
When you're in an unhappy marriage, the thing that can keep you going is a very good friend, is a close friend, is a confidant, a soulmate.
He's always on at me, Rena, stop sleeping so much. Rena, stop eating so much.
I had no idea. Any consolation, Keith and I have troubles too.
Really?
Lorna tries to reassure her friend that everything will be all right. But it won't be.
Rena, we need to talk. We're not happy, Rena.
What are you trying to say?
It's over, Rena.
When he ultimately rejected her, she felt that it had all been for nothing, that she'd humiliated herself. And she did have a very strong fear of rejection.
If you leave me, I'll make you regret it.
I've made my decision.
Staying in a loveless marriage is a good way to get trapped. And what happens to people when they feel trapped? Nothing good.
In Berkshire, England, Rena Salmon is trying to save her marriage with support from friend Lorna Stewart.
You will not be able to resist doing that. I hope not.
Do you think we can work it out? He's just going through a phase. All men do.
But soon, Lorna finds herself listening to the other side.
That Lorna knew the secrets of his broken marriage, and that made her someone he could be more intimate with.
Do you, want to go for a drink? I could really use one.
Sure. Why not?
Paul decided that Lorna was the woman for him, and Lorna fell very hard for Paul.
You make it very hard for me to behave myself.
Their affair was an absolute classic. It was a cliche. They would go to hotels, making up excuses to their spouses as to where they were. And they really took risks.
This can wait.
The affair goes on for 3 months until Rena finds out.
Rena, what are you doing?
What you drove me to do.
What?
I know about Lorna.
This was the ultimate betrayal by Lorna on her supposed best friend.
Rena went into complete meltdown.
She was my best friend. How could you?
Gotta wait the kids.
Why do you care?
She was very, very badly affected.
If I die, I'll take them with me. I will.
It's one thing to become suicidal, but to develop a suicide pact with your children, at that point, Rena should have been hospitalized.
But Rena doesn't want help. She wants revenge.
Let me in! Lorna, let me in! Let me in! Now you can see what type of man your father is.
You didn't need to bring the kids into this.
Rena had so lost touch with reality that she didn't even think twice about involving her children in this toxic separation scenario.
Rena began treating her children as if they were her adult girlfriends, dragging them over to Lorna's and pointing at her and saying, "This is the woman that ruined our marriage."
Rena, stop. Rena, stop it now!
Rena attacks her husband with car keys.
She doesn't have an off switch anymore. She can only think of one thing, and that's her husband's betrayal.
Lorna leaves her husband and settles in with Paul. They're both ready for a fresh start.
I think I just felt a kick.
Rena probably hoped that Paul would eventually come back. But when she found out he was going to be having children with Lorna, that meant the fantasy wasn't going to happen. And Rena couldn't take it.
This is the final insult. This is the final nail in the coffin of her relationship with Paul. And she cannot accept it.
On September 10th, 2002, it all comes to a head. Rena plans to fix things.
When she finally decided the time was right to do it, you'd think she was getting ready for a big social event. She gets her best clothes and jewelry on.
Hi, Lorna.
Everything to her is mapped out, in a sense, in her head.
Please, Rena.
And Rena believes not only that she is right, but that she has the right to do what she's about to do.
Please don't. He's not worth it.
They were her last words.
Not only did Rena get rid of her nemesis by killing Lorna, Lorna was pregnant. So for sure, Paul would not be enjoying a new baby with another woman.
Rena sits down, gets out a packet of cigarettes, starts smoking. This is part of the normalness of that day for her.
She then texted Paul, and she told him that she'd shot and killed Lorna.
She was at the mountaintop at this point. The deed was done. Lorna was no longer around. She would not be having Paul's babies, and that's why she didn't run away. It's like, okay, take me. It's over.
As she's arrested, Rena pleads confusion.
I came here to shoot myself in front of her.
Rena said she planned on killing herself very publicly. Maybe that was her plan all along, maybe not. One thing is for sure, Rena's mind was a Disneyland of emotions.
In 2003, Rena Salmon is convicted of murder and sentenced to a minimum of 14 years behind bars. Jealousy, depression, and drugs are a potent mix at any time. But for this woman on the edge, it became a license to kill.
For Rena, the idea of a life without Paul was incomprehensible, and it caused her intense pain. By killing Lorna, she was eliminating the source of the pain.
In 2016, Rena is diagnosed with a terminal illness and released early.
The vast majority of people serving time in prison for murder are not dangerous. They had someone that they believed they needed to kill for whatever reason, and they will never kill again. Rena might be one of those people.
The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., the kind of ring that slices through sleep and leaves a house suddenly hollow, and when it stopped the silence felt louder than the sound ever had, heavier. Pressing down on the walls of a small Ohio home where the porch light had burned all night as if waiting for someone who never came back. Snow clung to the edges of the driveway like a held breath, and the air carried that metallic winter smell that makes every sound feel sharp, every step too loud, as if the night itself were listening. Somewhere between the last ticking second and the first question that no one wanted to ask, a life slipped out of alignment, and the town would spend decades trying to push it back into place. It was 1993, and the town sat the way many Ohio towns do, low and wide, stitched together by two-lane roads and habits older than the storefronts that lined Main Street. People knew the rhythm of one another's days, the times the bakery opened, the nights the high school lights came on, the neighbors who waved and the neighbors who watched. Nothing about that winter suggested it would become a headline, nothing that warned of the word cold case, of years stacked like unopened letters, of a name whispered long after the sound of it should have faded. The missing woman had left her house earlier that evening, a routine drive, a short errand, the kind of trip you don't remember finishing because it's too ordinary to mark. She didn't come home. By morning, ordinary had curdled into panic. Police cruisers cut slow arcs through the neighborhood, tires hissing on slush, headlights sweeping across mailboxes and hedges, the glow sliding over faces drawn tight with worry. Officers knocked on doors that opened in bathrobes and fear, asking the same questions in the same calm tones, as if calm itself could keep the day from breaking. When was the last time you saw her? Did you hear anything? Did you notice a car you didn't recognize? The answers came haltingly, fragments of memory pulled loose by adrenaline, and each fragment felt both essential and useless, a puzzle piece with no edges. In the woman's driveway, her car sat exactly where it always did, keys missing, interior clean, no sign of a struggle, no broken glass to point a finger at the night. The absence was too neat, and that neatness frightened people more than chaos ever could. By noon the local news vans arrived, antennas lifting like insects tasting the air, and the story began to harden into shape. A photo was chosen, one that showed her smiling, hair caught mid-laugh, the kind of picture that turns a person into a symbol even as it tries to keep them human. The words followed quickly: missing, mysterious, concerned community. Volunteers gathered with thermoses and maps, boots crunching through snow as they fanned out across fields and ditches, calling a name that the wind carried away without answering. Dogs strained at leashes, noses low, circling, doubling back, confused by the overlap of so many human scents laid down in urgency. The search felt frantic and methodical at the same time, hope moving in step with dread. Inside the police station, the case file began to grow. Timestamps. Names. The careful language of reports that tried not to assume what no one wanted to say out loud. Detectives retraced the route she would have taken, a ribbon of asphalt past darkened lots and shuttered shops, past a gas station where the clerk swore he'd seen nothing unusual, past an intersection where a traffic light blinked yellow through the early hours, indifferent to human drama. They noted a neighbor who remembered a door closing, another who thought they heard a car idle longer than necessary, a third who recalled nothing at all and apologized as if memory were a moral failing. Every recollection felt important until it didn't, until it slipped under scrutiny and re-emerged as noise. Days passed, and the town's posture changed. Lawns went uncut. Curtains stayed drawn. Conversations dropped when strangers approached. The missing woman's name became a shorthand for unease, a way to reference the thing everyone felt but didn't know how to address. Parents drove their kids to school even when the bus came. Locks clicked earlier. The familiar turned suspect, and the suspect tried to look familiar. Police announced they were expanding the search radius, that they were following leads, that they urged anyone with information to come forward. The words sounded practiced, but the eyes behind them were tired. A week in, the temperature dipped again, and the ground hardened. Searchers found a glove near a creek, then another, and for a moment the case seemed to inhale, to swell with the possibility of resolution, but the gloves were old, discarded, unrelated, and the breath leaked out slowly. The file thickened anyway, pages sliding into folders, the physical weight of paper standing in for progress. Detectives worked late, the hum of fluorescent lights making every thought feel exposed. They ran background checks, traced phone records, followed up on tips that arrived by the dozen, some earnest, some cruel, some shaped by imagination and fear. The town watched and waited, measuring days by the absence of news. It was around this time that the quiet neighbor began to appear in conversations, not as an accusation, not yet, but as a detail that refused to stay quiet. He lived 2 houses down, kept to himself, nodded politely, mowed his lawn in straight lines. He had lived there for years, long enough to blend into the scenery of the street, long enough to be noticed only by his absence from notice. Someone remembered seeing his porch light on late that night. Someone else thought his car wasn't where it usually sat. A third said he'd asked strange questions the next morning, too curious, too focused. Each comment alone meant nothing. Together, they hummed. Detectives did what detectives do. They knocked. They asked. They listened. The neighbor answered the door with a mild smile, offered coffee, seemed genuinely concerned, produced an alibi that rested on sleep and solitude, on the unprovable act of being alone at night. His house was tidy. His answers were measured. Nothing in the room leapt out and shouted guilt. When they left, they wrote it down and moved on, because moving on is sometimes the only way forward, even when forward feels wrong. The neighbor returned to his routines, and the street exhaled, relieved to place suspicion back on the abstract night. Winter slid into spring, and the case slid with it, out of the headlines and into the long hallway of unresolved things. The missing woman's face faded from the nightly news but not from the corkboard at the station, where it stared back at anyone who lingered too long. Her family learned the vocabulary of waiting, the way hope can sharpen into pain, the way time can feel like a betrayal. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived and left. The town learned how to live around the empty space without ever filling it. Years later, when When people spoke about that winter, they did so with a kind of careful reverence, as if the words themselves could disturb something buried. They talked about how nothing was ever the same after, how the sense of safety had thinned, how every quiet street carried an echo. They talked about cold cases as if cold were a temperature you could get used to, as if the chill didn't seep into bones. The file waited. Evidence aged. Memories softened at the edges. The quiet neighbor kept mowing his lawn, nodding to passers-by, blending back into the background where he had always lived. And yet, beneath the routines and reassurances, the case never truly slept. It lingered in the pauses of interviews, in the way detectives' eyes returned to certain names, in the late-night replays of routes and timelines that refused to line up cleanly. The unanswered questions stacked themselves neatly, patient and heavy. Somewhere in the town, a porch light clicked on again, casting a familiar glow across a driveway, and the silence that followed felt like a promise waiting to be broken. The case didn't die so much as it cooled, settling into the corners of the department like dust that no one could quite bring themselves to wipe away, and every few months someone would open the file again, flip through the pages, and feel the same dull pressure behind the eyes. The same sense that the truth was sitting just out of reach, watching. In the late summer of 1994, a new detective inherited the folder, its edges soft from handling, its tabs labeled in ink that had begun to fade. He read it straight through in one sitting, past the routine reports and the early urgency, past the moments where the narrative seemed to stutter and stall, and he noticed what others had noticed before him but never quite trusted, the timeline bent in small, almost polite ways. And every bend pointed back toward the same narrow stretch of street. He drove it himself one evening, that quiet block where nothing seemed to happen, where the houses wore their sameness like a disguise. He parked where the missing woman's car had been found, sat with the engine off, and let the night speak. Porch lights dotted the street like watchful eyes. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. Tires whispered on a distant road. It was all too normal, too clean, the kind of place where crimes felt imported, not homegrown. He imagined the woman stepping out into the cold months earlier, keys in hand, breath fogging, unaware that the ordinariness of the moment was about to become its most sinister feature. Neighbors had changed since then. Some moved away, carrying the story with them like a scar. New families arrived, unaware at first of what had happened, learning only when someone mentioned it in a lowered voice at a block party or when a search dog's ghost seemed to cross a lawn in memory. But the quiet neighbor was still there, same house, same routines, a constant note in a song that otherwise shifted with time. The detective watched the house for a while, not in the cinematic sense of surveillance, but in the human sense of trying to see what had always been there. Lights on. Lights off. No drama. Just presence. Back at the station, he pulled the neighbor's name and ran it again, a deeper dive this time, not because of new evidence but because of old discomfort. Employment history. Financial records. A minor incident years before, dismissed as nothing. No violent past. No obvious motive. The file remained stubbornly ordinary. Still, the detective added a fresh tab, wrote a note in the margin, and kept reading. He noticed how often the neighbor's name appeared in passing, how many tips circled him without ever landing, how many times investigators had paused and then moved on. It felt less like coincidence and more like avoidance. In 1995, a witness came forward late, someone who'd been out of town during the initial search, someone who'd only recently connected a memory to the missing woman's face on a faded flyer. He remembered a car idling that night, engine low, lights off, parked at an odd angle near the neighbor's driveway. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. He thought about it now. The statement was taken, logged, weighed. Without corroboration, it joined the stack of maybes. The case exhaled again, settling back into its long sleep. Time did what time always does. Technology advanced. Faces aged. The town learned to reference the case with a shorthand that implied understanding without requiring detail. Cold case became a phrase you could say without feeling the cold. Detectives retired. New ones arrived. The file migrated from desk to desk, carrying with it the faint smell of paper and frustration. Every now and then, a reporter called, asking if there was anything new, and the answer was always the same, delivered with practiced neutrality. No new leads at this time. But inside the department, the neighbor's name never quite disappeared. It surfaced during reviews, during training exercises on unresolved cases, during late-night conversations when the day's work was done and the mind wandered to the things that hadn't been finished. Some thought the focus was unfair, a product of proximity and personality rather than proof. Others felt a pull they couldn't articulate, a sense that quiet could be as loud as any scream if you listened long enough. In 1998, a small break appeared, not as a revelation but as an opportunity. Advances in forensic science offered the chance to re-examine old evidence, to extract new meaning from items that had been boxed and shelved. The department sent what they had to the lab: fibers, a partial print, a scrap of material whose origin had never been identified. The wait was long, the process slow, and when the results came back they were, at first glance, disappointing. Inconclusive. Degraded. Not enough to build anything on. But one analyst noted a pattern, a suggestion, something that might align with a known source if that source were known. It was a whisper, not a voice. The detective returned to the street again, this time during the day, sunlight flattening shadows, children riding bikes where searchers had once walked with eyes on the ground. He knocked on doors, introduced himself to people who had lived there since before the winter of 1993. Some were eager to talk, relieved to unburden memories they'd carried too long. Others were guarded, wary of reopening wounds. When he knocked on the quiet neighbor's door, the man answered with the same mild expression, the same careful politeness. They spoke about the weather, about the street, about the years that had passed. The neighbor remembered the missing woman, spoke of her kindly, expressed hope that answers would come someday. His voice never wavered. As the detective left, he noticed something small, almost nothing at all, a detail that might have meant nothing to anyone else. The neighbor watched him go, not with fear or anger, but with an intensity that felt out of place, eyes following until the car turned the corner. The detective wrote it down, aware of how thin such observations were, how easily they could be dismissed as projection. Still, the note joined the others, a growing constellation of unease. The early 2000s brought renewed attention to cold cases nationwide, stories of long-buried crimes solved by persistence and progress. Families who had waited decades saw arrests made, names cleared, truths spoken aloud at last. The department felt the pressure, internal and external, to revisit its own unresolved past. The Ohio case was dusted off again, reviewed in meetings where timelines were redrawn and assumptions challenged. Someone suggested a fresh look at the neighbor, not as a suspect but as a point of reference, a constant around which the case had always orbited. There were nods. There were sighs. There was no consensus. In 2004, a former co-worker of the neighbor contacted police, prompted by a news segment about cold cases. He spoke hesitantly, aware of the weight of what he was about to say. He remembered conversations, offhand comments made years earlier, remarks that at the time seemed like dark humor or awkward curiosity. Now, reframed by the missing woman's story, they felt different. The statement was taken. It added texture but not substance, color without shape. Still, it tightened the focus. The neighbor was interviewed again, this time with more pointed questions, more direct framing. He answered patiently, occasionally asking why these questions were coming now, after so long. The detectives explained advances, renewed efforts, the simple fact that time had not erased the need for answers. The neighbor nodded, expressed understanding, reiterated his willingness to help. When the interview ended, there was still nothing to hold on to, nothing that could survive the glare of a courtroom. Outside, the town continued to live. New stores opened. Old ones closed. The missing woman's family marked anniversaries quietly, their grief a steady undercurrent. The quiet neighbor attended community events, spoke when spoken to, remained unremarkable. And yet, in the department, the case began to warm, just slightly, as if the years had finally aligned enough for friction. Late one night, the detective sat alone with the file, reading through everything again, this time not looking for what was there but for what wasn't. He noticed gaps where follow-ups should have been, moments where assumptions had been made and never tested. He noticed how often the neighbor's alibi rested on the absence of witnesses, on the invisibility of solitude. He closed the folder and stared at the wall, aware that the difference between suspicion and proof was vast, and that crossing it would require more than instinct. The street was quiet when he drove home, porch lights glowing, windows dark. Somewhere, a television murmured behind closed curtains. The detective thought about how silence could be mistaken for peace, how calm could hide currents strong enough to pull a life under without leaving a ripple. The case was still unresolved, officially cold, but the air around it had shifted, charged with the possibility that the quietest presence on the block might one day become the loudest name in the room. By the time the new millennium settled in, the case had become a kind of internal weather system, always present, occasionally violent, mostly ignored until a change in pressure made it impossible to forget. The detective who now carried it felt that shift in his bones during a routine audit, a bureaucratic exercise meant to clear shelves and close loops, when the file resisted closure with a stubbornness that felt personal. He spread the contents across a conference table, pages overlapping like shingles, and traced the story again with his finger, noticing how the narrative never actually left the block where it began, how it kept circling back as if the truth were tethered there. He called in a favor from a colleague in records, asked for everything tied to the street during that winter, not just the missing woman's file but incident reports, noise complaints, minor accidents, anything that might have brushed up against the night in question. The stack that arrived was thicker than expected, a reminder that even quiet places generate a steady hum of documentation. As he read, patterns began to suggest themselves, not the clean lines of evidence but the softer shapes of behavior. A late-night call about a suspicious vehicle. A report of lights off where they were usually on. A note about a resident seen walking at an unusual hour. Individually forgettable. Together, they leaned. The detective returned to the neighbor's house again, this time under the pretext of updating residents on the renewed effort. He stood on the porch and felt the familiar mismatch between the banality of the setting and the gravity of the questions he carried. The neighbor listened, nodded, expressed appreciation for the update. He mentioned how hard it must be to keep cases alive for so long, how some things just never find their endings. The comment landed with a soft thud. The detective smiled, thanked him, and left with the sense that the conversation had been a performance they both understood without acknowledging. Inside the department, skepticism grew alongside interest. Some officers worried about tunnel vision, about the danger of letting a single name dominate a case for reasons that were more emotional than evidentiary. Others argued that the danger lay in ignoring the obvious because it was uncomfortable. Meetings grew longer. Whiteboards filled with timelines that were erased and redrawn. The neighbor's name appeared and disappeared, written lightly, circled, then wiped away, as if the marker itself were unsure. In 2007, a breakthrough arrived from an unexpected direction. A retired officer, cleaning out his garage, found a box of personal notes he'd kept from cases he couldn't forget. Inside was a small notebook with dates and observations that never made it into official reports, details he'd jotted down for himself during long nights when instincts spoke louder than procedure. One entry caught the detective's eye. It referenced a conversation with the neighbor shortly after the disappearance, a remark about timing that seemed innocuous on paper but unsettling in context. The retired officer was contacted, interviewed, his memory probed gently but thoroughly. He admitted he'd felt something was off back then but lacked the authority or clarity to pursue it. The note didn't prove anything. It did something else. It validated a feeling that had survived the years. Around the same time, advances in data analysis offered new tools for old problems. Phone records, once a labyrinth of paper and microfilm, could now be cross-referenced with precision. The detective requested a reanalysis of calls made and received in the neighborhood during the critical window. The process was slow, complicated by changes in providers and retention policies, but fragments emerged. A call placed and disconnected. A phone powered off for an unusual stretch. Again, nothing definitive, but the edges of the night grew sharper. The neighbor was asked, once more, to account for his movements, his routines, his devices. He complied, handing over what was requested, answering questions with the same steady calm. His explanations were plausible, consistent, unruffled by repetition. The detectives noticed how practiced his responses had become, how easily he navigated the story he'd told for years. They wondered whether consistency was a sign of truth or of rehearsal. They noted the way he corrected himself, just slightly, on details that no one else would remember to correct. They wrote it all down. Outside the station, the community's relationship with the case evolved. Younger residents, who had been children or not yet born in 1993, encountered the story as history, a cautionary tale rather than a lived trauma. Older residents carried it differently, as a memory that could still tighten the chest without warning. When rumors surfaced of renewed focus on the neighbor, reactions were mixed. Some dismissed it as harassment, an unfair targeting of a man who had lived quietly for decades. Others felt a grim satisfaction, a sense that the thing they'd never quite trusted was finally being acknowledged. The detective felt the weight of that scrutiny acutely. He knew that pursuing the neighbor without ironclad evidence risked not only the case but the credibility of everyone involved. He also knew that waiting for perfect proof in a case defined by absence might mean waiting forever. The balance between caution and courage narrowed, became a tightrope stretched over years of failure. In 2010, a cold case unit was formally established, its mandate clear: revisit, reassess, resolve. The Ohio case was among the first assigned. Fresh eyes joined the effort, analysts who hadn't lived with the frustration, who approached the file without the emotional calluses of long exposure. They asked naive questions that turned out not to be naive at all. Why was this assumption made? Why wasn't this follow-up done? Why did we accept this timeline as fixed? Their curiosity reopened doors that had been closed by fatigue rather than certainty. One analyst fixated on the neighbor's proximity, not just geographically but temporally. She mapped his routines against the missing woman's, noting overlaps that hadn't been emphasized before. She highlighted moments where his reported activities aligned too neatly with gaps in surveillance or witness accounts. She presented her findings in a meeting that grew quiet as she spoke, the room's attention narrowing to the map on the screen, the red lines converging. Still, the legal threshold loomed. The prosecutor assigned to consult on the case was blunt. Circumstantial was not enough. Suspicion was not enough. If they were going to name the neighbor publicly, to label him anything more than a person of interest, they needed something that could survive cross-examination, something tangible, something that didn't rely on reading between lines that defense attorneys would happily erase. Pressure mounted from another direction. A national true crime series expressed interest in the case, promising exposure that could generate new leads but also inviting scrutiny and speculation. The department hesitated, aware of the double-edged nature of attention. In the end, they agreed to a limited feature, careful to control the narrative, careful to avoid naming names. The episode aired, and tips poured in, most of them noise, some of them echoes of things already known, a few of them intriguing. One tip stood out. An anonymous caller claimed to have overheard a conversation years earlier, a confession whispered and laughed off, a statement about getting away with something because no one ever looks at the quiet ones. The caller provided details that suggested familiarity, not just with the case but with the people involved. Investigators traced the call as far as they could, hit walls, tried again. The voice remained unclaimed, the words hanging in the air like smoke. The neighbor, for his part, seemed aware of the shifting atmosphere. He withdrew further, attended fewer community events, kept his interactions brief. Some interpreted this as guilt. Others saw it as fear, the reaction of a man tired of being eyed sideways. The detective watched, listened, resisted the urge to interpret too much. He reminded himself that behavior was evidence only in the loosest sense, that certainty demanded more. Late one evening, reviewing the file yet again, he noticed something that had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. A discrepancy in timestamps between two reports, small enough to be dismissed as clerical error, large enough to matter if intentional. He cross-checked, recalculated, followed the thread. The discrepancy placed someone where they said they weren't, at a moment that mattered. His pulse quickened, not with triumph but with the familiar mix of hope and dread. He flagged it, brought it to the team, watched as others leaned in, saw the same thing. They moved carefully, verifying, corroborating, resisting the urge to declare victory. When they approached the neighbor with the new information, his reaction was subtle but different. A pause. A tightening around the eyes. A question asked twice. It was nothing that could be cited in court, nothing that would make headlines, but in the room it felt seismic. The detective left the interview with the sense that the ground had shifted beneath a story long thought immovable. The case was still officially unresolved. No arrests. No charges. No closure. But the narrative had changed. The quiet neighbor was no longer just a name that surfaced and sank. He was a focal point, a gravity well drawing the scattered pieces inward. The detective understood that what came next would define not only the case but the years spent chasing it. He locked the file away that night with a different feeling than before, not relief, not satisfaction, but the uneasy certainty that the silence surrounding the case was finally starting to crack, and when it broke, it would do so loudly enough to be heard far beyond the quiet street where it all began. The crack didn't announce itself with noise or drama. It spread the way ice does under pressure, silently at first, then all at once, and inside the department the air shifted as if everyone felt it at the same time. Meetings that had once been theoretical became operational. Language tightened. Words like if and maybe were replaced with when and how. The discrepancy in the timeline was pinned to the wall, circled in red, stared at until it began to feel accusatory. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was leverage, the kind that forces a case to move whether it wants to or not. They rebuilt the night from scratch, minute by minute, refusing to rely on memory or assumption. Weather reports. Traffic light cycles. Store closing times. Every mundane detail became a gear in a larger machine, and slowly the machine began to turn. The missing woman's route was recalculated, her likely pace estimated, the window of opportunity narrowed. When the pieces were laid over the neighbor's reported movements, the overlap was no longer polite. It was aggressive. It demanded explanation. The detective felt a familiar tension settle in his chest, the awareness that pushing too hard could collapse the case while not pushing hard enough could condemn it to another decade of waiting. He slept poorly, waking with fragments of the timeline looping in his head, numbers replacing faces, moments stretching and compressing. He thought about the family, about the way time had eroded their expectations until hope felt almost irresponsible. He thought about the neighbor, about the possibility that an entire life could be constructed atop a single, carefully hidden act. They brought in an external consultant, a behavioral analyst with no ties to the town, no emotional investment in the case's history. She read the file without commentary, asked for transcripts, asked for audio, asked to see the neighbor's interviews back to back. She watched his face as much as his words, listened to cadence, to the spaces between sentences. Her conclusions were cautious, professionally so, but they carried weight. There were indicators of control, of narrative management, of someone accustomed to steering perception. Indicators were not evidence, but they added to the growing sense that the case was no longer static. The next step was inevitable and dangerous. A search warrant. The idea had been floated before and dismissed for lack of probable cause. Now, with the timeline discrepancy, the reanalyzed records, the accumulation of witness statements old and new, the argument could be made. It would be a risk, a public declaration of suspicion that could not be taken back. The prosecutor reviewed the affidavit with a surgeon's focus, cutting away speculation, demanding justification for every claim. It took days. It felt like years. When the warrant was signed, there was no celebration, only a quiet nodding around the table, the shared understanding that this was the point of no return. They planned the approach carefully, mindful of optics, of safety, of the neighbor's rights. Early morning. Minimal presence. Professional distance. The goal was not spectacle but truth. The street woke to the soft intrusion of unmarked vehicles, doors closing with careful restraint, officers moving with practiced calm. Curtains twitched. Porch lights clicked on. The neighbor answered the knock in slippers, surprise flickering briefly before settling into composure. He read the warrant, asked a question about scope, stepped aside. His house, so familiar from the outside, revealed itself room by room, ordinary and unremarkable. Furniture. Photographs. A life arranged neatly. They searched slowly, methodically, documenting everything, touching nothing without purpose. The air felt thick, charged with the knowledge that meaning could be hiding anywhere or nowhere at all. In the garage, boxes were opened, their contents catalogued. Tools. Old clothes. Holiday decorations. In the basement, shelves lined with labeled containers suggested order, foresight. The neighbor watched from a chair, hands folded, offering explanations when asked, volunteering context, narrating his own space. Then, in a back corner, beneath items that had clearly not been moved in years, they found something that didn't fit. Not dramatic. Not incriminating at first glance. A bag containing fabric that matched, in weave and age, the unidentified scrap that had haunted the file since the 90s. The analyst's whisper found its voice. The room seemed to hold its breath. The neighbor's face changed, just enough to notice if you were looking for it. He asked what they had found. The detective answered neutrally, aware of the line he walked. The item was bagged, tagged, removed. It would take time to know what it meant, if it meant anything at all. But the tone of the search had shifted, and everyone in the house felt it. News traveled fast in a town like this. By afternoon, rumors had outrun facts, headlines forming before statements could be crafted. The department released a careful acknowledgement of ongoing investigative activity, no names, no conclusions. It did little to stem the tide. The quiet neighbor was no longer quiet in conversation. His house became a point of reference, a place people slowed as they drove past, curiosity and judgment blurring together. The lab work took weeks. Each day stretched, elastic with anticipation. When the results came back, they were cautious but promising. The fibers were consistent. Not a match in the cinematic sense, but a link, a physical thread connecting the neighbor's space to the unresolved evidence. Combined with the timeline, the statements, the behavioral indicators, it formed something new. A case that could be argued. They brought the neighbor in again, this time not as a courtesy interview but as a formal interrogation. The room was small, the table scarred with the marks of other truths wrestled into the open. The neighbor sat straight-backed, hands visible, eyes alert. The detective laid out the evidence slowly, watching reactions, allowing silence to do its work. The neighbor responded with questions of his own, with explanations that grew more complex as they went, details multiplying where simplicity would have sufficed. Hours passed. The narrative frayed. Contradictions emerged, subtle at first, then undeniable. The neighbor corrected himself, then corrected the correction. He grew defensive, then conciliatory, then defensive again. The detective pressed, not with accusation but with patience, letting the weight of the inconsistencies settle. When the neighbor asked for a lawyer, the room exhaled, the tension breaking not into resolution but into acknowledgement. This was as far as they would go today. The arrest didn't come immediately. It couldn't. The prosecutor needed more, needed to be sure that the case could withstand not just scrutiny but attack. Defense counsel would dismantle anything less than solid. The team returned to the file with renewed urgency, hunting for corroboration, for the one piece that would anchor everything else. They revisited witnesses, old and new, asking questions they hadn't known to ask before. Some memories sharpened under the new light. Others crumbled. A former neighbor, now living out of state, recalled a night when voices had carried across the yards, a raised tone that had startled him awake. He dismissed it then as an argument, nothing worth reporting. Now, he wondered. His statement added another layer, another angle. A delivery driver from years past remembered an unusual request, a package dropped late, paid in cash. Records were thin. The memory was all they had. It joined the mosaic. The family was informed, cautiously, of the developments. They listened, absorbing the information with the weary grace of people who had learned not to trust momentum. They asked careful questions. They did not celebrate. They had lived too long in the space between promise and proof to do otherwise. Still, something changed in their posture, a straightening, a readiness they hadn't felt in years. As the case edged closer to the threshold of action, the town held its breath again, echoing that first winter's anxiety but tempered now by time and cynicism. Some defended the neighbor fiercely, citing decades of normalcy as evidence of innocence. Others felt vindicated, their long-held suspicions finally given voice. Social lines hardened. Conversations grew sharp. The case, once a shared wound, became a fault line. Late one night, the detective returned to the street alone, parked under a tree that had grown taller since 1993. He looked at the houses, at the lights glowing behind curtains, at the neighbor's place now dark and empty, sealed by tape and attention. He thought about how evil rarely announces itself, how it prefers to blend, to be mistaken for quiet. He thought about how long it had taken to hear what the case had been saying all along. The decision came the following week. The prosecutor, convinced that the accumulation of evidence crossed the necessary line, authorized the arrest. The warrant was prepared, the charges outlined, the language precise. When officers went to take the neighbor into custody, there were cameras this time, microphones, the machinery of public reckoning. The neighbor was led out, face unreadable, the street watching from behind windows and hedges. But even as the handcuffs closed, the detective felt no triumph. Only gravity. The knowledge that an arrest was not an ending but a beginning, that the truth would now have to survive the harshest light. The case that had haunted the department for decades was no longer cold, but it was not yet resolved. The silence had cracked, yes, but what emerged from it would determine whether the town finally found peace or traded one haunting for another. The arrest landed like a thunderclap that took a moment to be heard, the sound traveling through living rooms and kitchens, through phones held tight in shaking hands, through the long memory of a town that had learned to flinch at sudden noise. By the time the neighbor's name was spoken aloud on the evening news, it felt both shocking and inevitable, a revelation that rewrote the past even as it tried to explain it. The quiet had been broken, and what rushed in to fill it was not relief but a storm of questions. Inside the holding cell, the neighbor sat alone, the fluorescent light flattening his features into something almost unfamiliar. He stared at the wall, jaw set, breathing measured, as if discipline could still impose order on a situation that had slipped beyond his control. His attorney arrived quickly, a figure of crisp lines and careful words, and from that moment forward every statement would be weighed, every silence strategic. The narrative, once managed through politeness and omission, was now a legal object, to be shaped and defended with equal care. The prosecutor's office moved with deliberate speed, filing charges that reflected both the weight of the evidence and the fragility of its construction. They spoke of probable cause, of corroboration, of a case built not on a single smoking gun but on the convergence of many smaller fires. They avoided absolutes. They had learned, over decades, the cost of certainty declared too soon. The press, less restrained, filled the gaps with speculation, framing the arrest as the unmasking of a monster or the tragic downfall of a misunderstood man, depending on the outlet and the hour. For the family, the news arrived with a complicated force. They gathered in a living room that had hosted too many difficult conversations, listening as detectives explained what had happened and what would come next. There were tears, but they did not fall easily. There was anger, sharp and focused, but also a strange numbness, the result of hope deferred for so long that its return felt almost dangerous. They asked whether this meant answers, whether this meant finding her, whether this meant peace. The detectives answered honestly. It meant a chance. The defense wasted no time in setting its tone. The neighbor, now named and photographed, was described as a scapegoat, a victim of confirmation bias and public hunger for closure. His decades of quiet living were recast as evidence of stability, not secrecy. The fibers were dismissed as coincidence, the timeline discrepancies as clerical error magnified by obsession. Witness memories, stretched across years, were labeled unreliable. The defense promised to show how an ordinary life had been misread, how proximity had been mistaken for guilt. Pre-trial hearings became the stage where these narratives collided, each side probing for weakness, each objection a small battle in a war of attrition. The detective watched from the back of the courtroom, his notebook closed, his mind replaying the case in a loop that had become second nature. He felt the familiar anxiety return, the fear that despite everything, despite the years of work, the truth might still slip away through the cracks of procedure. Outside the courthouse, the town gathered in small, shifting groups, debating in hushed tones or loud arguments depending on temperament. Some felt vindicated, their long-held suspicions finally affirmed by authority. Others bristled at what they saw as an injustice, a rush to judgment fueled by fear and hindsight. Yard signs appeared, some calling for justice, others for fairness. The case had ceased to be a shared mystery and become a mirror, reflecting the town's divisions back at itself. As the trial date approached, the prosecution made a decision that would define the case. They would argue not just what happened, but how it could happen in plain sight. They framed the neighbor's quiet as camouflage, his routines as cover, his ordinariness as the perfect shield. They spoke of opportunity, of control, of a moment when the missing woman's path crossed his in a way that could never be undone. It was a compelling story, built carefully to avoid overreach, to let the evidence speak while guiding the jury's attention. The defense countered with its own story, one of overzealous investigators and a community desperate for answers. They highlighted the absence of a body, the lack of direct forensic proof tying the neighbor to a crime scene, the dangers of building a case on inference. They reminded the court that suspicion, no matter how persistent, was not guilt, and that the burden of proof rested entirely with the state. Jury selection was tense, each side scrutinizing faces for signs of bias, for the subtle cues that might hint at allegiance or doubt. When the jury was finally seated, 12 individuals drawn from the same community that had lived with the case for decades, the weight of that responsibility settled visibly on their shoulders. They were not just judging a man. They were judging a history. The opening statements set the rhythm. The prosecutor spoke calmly, laying out a timeline that tightened like a noose, each point reinforcing the next. The defense followed with controlled indignation, warning against the seduction of a good story. The missing woman's name was spoken often, her photograph displayed briefly, respectfully. The courtroom felt heavy with her absence, an unspoken presence that hovered over every argument. Witnesses took the stand, one by one, their testimonies stitching together the fabric of the case. The retired officer described his notes, his lingering unease. The analyst explained fiber consistency in careful, accessible language. Neighbors spoke of lights and sounds and moments that had seemed trivial until they weren't. Each testimony added weight, but also vulnerability, each one an opportunity for the defense to poke holes, to suggest alternative interpretations. The neighbor watched it all with an expression that oscillated between attentiveness and detachment. When his attorney leaned in to whisper, he nodded. When witnesses spoke of him, he remained still, the picture of restraint. The jury watched him too, measuring his reactions, searching for something definitive in a face that had spent years practicing neutrality. The defense's cross-examinations were sharp, often effective. They exposed inconsistencies, highlighted gaps, reminded the court how much time had passed. They questioned motives, suggested memory contamination, implied that the investigation had shaped the evidence rather than the other way around. At moments, the prosecution's case seemed to wobble, the careful structure bending under pressure. Then came the moment everyone had anticipated and dreaded. The prosecution called the detective to the stand. He spoke of the case's evolution, of the slow accumulation of concern, of the responsibility to pursue leads even when they were uncomfortable. He was careful, precise, resisting the urge to editorialize. When asked why the neighbor had become the focus, he answered simply, because the evidence pointed there, again and again, despite efforts to look elsewhere. Under cross-examination, he faced the familiar challenges. Why now? Why not before? Could this have been handled differently? He acknowledged missteps, the limitations of the past, the ways in which time had both hindered and helped. He did not claim perfection. He claimed persistence. The jury listened. As the trial wore on, the absence at its center grew louder. No remains. No confession. The missing woman existed only through memory and implication. The defense leaned heavily on this, urging the jury to consider the danger of filling that void with assumption. The prosecution, in turn, argued that absence could be evidence too, that some crimes were defined by what they erased. Closing arguments drew the threads together, each side appealing to reason, to caution, to the gravity of the decision ahead. The prosecutor asked the jury to see the pattern, to recognize how the pieces fit when viewed without denial. The defense asked them to resist pressure, to honor the principle that doubt must favor the accused. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied slowly, as if reluctant to release the tension it had contained. Outside, the town waited again, the old familiar posture returning, shoulders hunched against an outcome that could redefine everything. Hours stretched. Night fell. Morning crept in. The verdict, when it came, did not deliver the clean release some had hoped for. It landed with complexity, with caveats, with the acknowledgement that truth in cases like this rarely arrives whole. The neighbor was found guilty on some counts, not guilty on others, the jury wrestling with the evidence and its limits. There were gasps. There were tears. There was confusion. Sentencing was set for a later date. Appeals were promised. The legal process, relentless and slow, would continue. For the family, the verdict was both validation and frustration, a partial answer that left too much unsaid. For the town, it was a reckoning, a forced confrontation with the idea that the familiar could harbor the unthinkable. As the courtroom emptied for the last time that day, the detective remained seated for a moment, absorbing the quiet that followed. The case that had defined so much of his career was no longer a question mark, but it was not a period either. It was a comma, a pause that suggested continuation. Outside, the street where it all began looked much as it always had. Houses stood in orderly rows. Lawns were trimmed. Porch lights flickered on as evening settled. Life went on, as it must. But beneath the routines, something had shifted permanently. The town would never look at quiet the same way again, and the echo of that winter night, though altered by judgment and time, would continue to ripple outward, a reminder that some stories refuse to end cleanly, and that the truth, once disturbed, never fully goes back to sleep. The appeal began the way all appeals do, quietly, with paperwork and measured language, a return to abstraction after the raw exposure of the courtroom. While the town argued the verdict in diners and online forums, the legal process retreated behind closed doors, where words like procedural and precedent replaced the human weight of testimony. The neighbor was transferred to a facility hours away, his absence from the street both a relief and a provocation, the empty house standing like a punctuation mark no one knew how to read. For the family, the days after the verdict were strangely hollow. They had imagined this moment for years, rehearsed reactions they never fully trusted, and now that it had arrived it refused to behave. There was no rush of closure, no sudden quieting of the mind. Instead, questions multiplied. Where was she? What exactly happened that night? What had been missed? Justice, it turned out, was not a destination but a terrain, uneven and exhausting to cross. Inside the department, the case was not archived. It couldn't be. The partial verdict left doors open, obligations unfinished. Detectives continued to work angles that had been set aside during trial preparation, chasing threads that had been too thin or too risky to pull before. One of those threads led back to a property the neighbor had owned briefly in the late 90s, a rural parcel sold quickly and quietly. At the time, it had seemed irrelevant, a footnote in a life otherwise anchored to the same street. Now, it demanded attention. They drove out there on a gray morning, the land stretched flat and patient, marked by fence posts and scrub. The structure that had once stood there was gone, dismantled years earlier, the ground smoothed as if nothing had ever happened. They walked the perimeter, noting depressions, changes in soil color, places where vegetation grew differently. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in, its slow passes across the earth producing images that suggested disturbances, not definitive, but suggestive enough to warrant excavation. News of the search leaked before the first shovel broke ground. Cameras appeared at the edge of the property, reporters narrating cautiously, careful not to promise what they could not deliver. The family watched from home, hearts clenched, bracing for either revelation or another letdown. The detectives worked methodically, sifting soil, cataloging findings, managing expectations even as their own hopes rose and fell with each layer removed. They found items. Fragments. Pieces that could have belonged to anyone or no one, that could have arrived there by chance or intention. Each was logged, bagged, sent for analysis. Days turned into weeks. The land yielded nothing that could answer the central question. When the search concluded, the official statement was restrained, acknowledging the effort without declaring outcome. The absence pressed in again, heavier for having been briefly lifted. The defense seized on the lack of discovery, framing it as further evidence of overreach. Motions were filed, arguments sharpened. The appeal gained momentum, its language increasingly confident. The prosecution responded in kind, emphasizing the jury's findings, the sufficiency of the evidence presented. The case moved upward, into a realm where it would be argued by people who had not walked the street, who had not felt the winter air or heard the echoes of the search. The story would be reduced to transcripts and exhibits, its emotional core translated into citations. Meanwhile, the town adjusted to a new normal that felt no less strange than the old one. The neighbor's house was sold, then sold again, its history disclosed in careful legal language that avoided adjectives. New residents moved in, drawn by price and proximity, learning the story gradually, through sideways glances and delayed disclosures. Some nights, they said later, the street felt heavier than others, as if memory had a gravity of its own. The detective found himself thinking more about time than evidence. About how long it had taken to arrive at a verdict that still felt provisional. About how easily years could pass without resolution, how quickly momentum could dissipate once the headlines moved on. He worried that the appeal, regardless of outcome, would cool the case again, returning it to a state of suspended animation where effort felt futile. Then, unexpectedly, a call came from another state. A detective there had been reviewing old cases with similarities to Ohio's, prompted by a training exercise on pattern recognition. One file stood out, a disappearance from the early 90s, a woman, a quiet neighborhood, a neighbor who blended in. The suspect in that case had never been charged, the evidence insufficient, the trail cold. But there were overlaps that were difficult to ignore. They shared files, compared notes, laid timelines side by side. The similarities were not perfect, not enough to declare a pattern outright, but enough to suggest that what had happened in Ohio might not have been isolated. The neighbors' movements during certain periods aligned uncomfortably with gaps in other investigations. Travel records, once overlooked, took on new significance. The information was forwarded to prosecutors, added to the growing dossier. It could not be introduced retroactively into the original trial, but it mattered for the appeal, for the broader understanding of who the neighbor might have been. It mattered for the family, who were informed cautiously, their hope tempered by experience. It mattered for the detective, who felt the case widen, its implications stretching beyond the borders of the town. The appeal hearing arrived without ceremony, a scheduled date circled on calendars that no longer buzzed with anticipation. Arguments were made about evidence admissibility, about the weight given to circumstantial findings, about the fairness of the trial. Judges listened, asked questions, took notes. Their faces revealed nothing. When the hearing ended, the waiting resumed. During that wait, another tip arrived, quieter than the rest. A former acquaintance of the neighbor, now elderly, reached out through an intermediary. He spoke haltingly, uncertain of his memories, apologetic for the delay. He remembered a conversation years ago, a night of drinking, a remark that had chilled him even then. At the time, he'd dismissed it as bravado. Now, with the verdict and the news, it felt different. He provided details that aligned with known facts, details that had not been public. The statement was taken, corroborated where possible. It did not stand alone, but it reinforced. The mosaic grew denser, its picture clearer not through any single tile but through accumulation. The detective felt the familiar mix of relief and frustration. Relief that the case continued to speak. Frustration that it did so only in fragments. When the appellate decision came down, it was mixed, a partial affirmation that upheld key aspects of the conviction while remanding others for review. The neighbor remained incarcerated, the legal process still grinding forward. There would be more hearings, more arguments, more waiting. The case refused to settle into a final shape. For the family, the decision was another step in a journey that had never offered straight lines. They marked it quietly, aware now that closure, if it came at all, would arrive in pieces. They had learned to live with commas. The detective returned once more to the street, now changed in subtle ways. Trees taller. Houses repainted. New cars in driveways. He stood for a moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of evening, the hum of engines, the laughter from an open window. He thought about how the case had taught him to distrust quiet, to look for meaning in what didn't draw attention. The cold case was no longer cold in the way it once had been, but it was not resolved either. It existed in a liminal space, warmed by effort, chilled by uncertainty. And as the night settled over the street, the detective understood that the story's power did not come from its conclusion, but from its persistence, from the way it continued to demand attention long after most people would have turned away, insisting that some silences, once broken, can never be fully restored. Time after the appeal moved differently, no longer racing toward verdicts or hearings but spreading outward, seeping into daily life the way damp cold settles into walls. The case lived on in margins and footnotes, in late-night emails between prosecutors, in quiet calls exchanged between detectives who no longer needed to explain why they were still invested. It had become something else now, not just a question of guilt or innocence, but a study in endurance, in how long a truth could resist being fully known. The neighbor adapted to incarceration with the same discipline he had applied to everything else. Guards noted his compliance, his silence, the way he avoided attention without appearing withdrawn. He wrote letters, carefully worded, to a small circle of supporters who still believed in his innocence. He declined interviews. He did not confess. The absence of a confession began to matter less than it once had. The case had taught everyone involved that some truths never arrive wrapped in words. Inside the prison walls, the neighbor watched the calendar with an intensity he had never shown on the outside. Appeal deadlines. Motion filings. Small procedural victories that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to him. His attorney visited regularly, their conversations focused and contained, always circling back to the same core argument, doubt. The law, after all, was built to protect doubt. Outside, the detective followed a different clock. He tracked patterns across years, not days. He reread transcripts, compared them with new statements, looked for harmonies that only emerged when enough voices overlapped. He spoke often with the out-of-state detective, their collaboration growing more fluid as trust replaced formality. Together they sketched a theory that was uncomfortable in its implications, one that suggested not a single moment of violence but a capacity for it, exercised more than once, hidden behind the same quiet mask. They were careful with the theory. It could not be proven. It could not yet be spoken aloud in any official capacity. But it guided questions, informed searches, shaped the way they read old files from other jurisdictions. Each similarity felt like a pressure point, each divergence a reminder of how easily patterns could deceive. The media returned in waves, drawn by anniversaries, by appellate rulings, by the enduring mystery of the missing woman's remains. Documentarians asked for interviews. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to the case, their hosts parsing timelines with the confidence of people who could pause and rewind. The town became accustomed to microphones at the edge of events, to strangers driving slowly down the street, looking for atmosphere. Some residents refused to talk. Others spoke eagerly, grateful for an audience after years of feeling unheard. The family participated selectively, aware of the risks and rewards of attention. They wanted answers, not spectacle. Still, they understood the value of light, the way it could draw out memories and guilt alike. Each appearance was measured, each statement careful, their grief now tempered by experience but no less real. A break came, not from a headline or a hearing, but from a storage unit. During a routine audit of seized property, an evidence technician flagged an item connected to the neighbor, stored under a generic label that had obscured its relevance for years. Inside was a box of personal effects collected during an unrelated inquiry in the late 90s, never fully examined because they had seemed inconsequential at the time. Among them were notebooks. The pages were dense with handwriting, lists and fragments, dates circled, names abbreviated. At first glance, they looked like the detritus of an orderly mind, records of chores and appointments. But as analysts read deeper, patterns emerged. References to locations. Times that aligned with known gaps. Phrases that could be interpreted as mundane or as something else entirely, depending on the lens. One entry, in particular, matched the night of the disappearance too closely to ignore. The notebooks were a gift and a trap. They suggested intentionality without stating it. They hinted at awareness without confessing to it. The prosecution moved carefully, consulting experts in handwriting analysis and behavioral interpretation. The defense prepared to argue ambiguity, to frame the notebooks as the harmless output of a meticulous personality. Still, the discovery injected new energy into the case. Motions were filed to admit the notebooks into the appellate record, to consider them in light of the original conviction. The judges reviewed arguments that balanced on a knife's edge between relevance and prejudice. The process stretched on, each delay amplifying the stakes. The detective returned again to the timeline, overlaying the notebook entries with known events, travel records, witness statements. The alignment was imperfect but suggestive. Enough to make him believe, more strongly than ever, that the case's truth existed not as a single revelation but as an accumulation that would only make sense when seen whole. In prison, word of the notebooks reached the neighbor quickly. His demeanor changed subtly. He became more guarded, less conversational even with those he trusted. His attorney advised restraint, silence, patience. The neighbor complied, retreating further into himself, his quiet now reinforced by concrete and steel. The appeal process ground forward. Another hearing. Another ruling. Incremental decisions that shaped the future without resolving the past. The conviction stood. The remanded issues narrowed. The possibility of a new trial flickered and dimmed. The law, like time, moved in increments that felt almost cruel in their slowness. For the town, the case faded again from the front page, replaced by newer scandals, fresher tragedies. But it never vanished completely. It lived in the way people still locked their doors early, in the caution that lingered when someone new moved in next door. It lived in the collective memory, a story told to newcomers not as gossip but as warning. The family marked another anniversary with a private gathering, lighting candles, sharing memories that had survived the years. They spoke of her not as a victim but as a presence, a person whose life had been larger than the moment that ended it. They spoke of forgiveness, not as absolution but as a way to keep living. Late that night, the detective reviewed the notebooks one more time, tracing a line under a sentence that had bothered him from the start. It was vague, almost poetic, a note about silence and timing. He wondered whether the neighbor had believed that writing it down made it manageable, containable. He wondered how many truths people bury in plain sight, trusting that ambiguity will protect them. The case, still unresolved in the ways that mattered most, continued to exert its pull. It had outlived careers, reshaped a community, redrawn the boundaries of trust. And as the years pressed on, the detective understood that the story's power lay not in the certainty it promised but in the vigilance it demanded, a reminder that some mysteries persist not because they cannot be solved, but because solving them requires a patience few are willing to sustain. The notebooks changed the temperature of the case, not enough to melt it into clarity, but enough to keep it from freezing again. They circulated through hands that understood restraint, analysts who resisted the urge to read intent where ambiguity lived, prosecutors who knew that every word added to the record would be tested, bent, and potentially broken. The pages were photographed, transcribed, indexed, and debated line by line, the margins filling with questions that felt heavier than answers. The quiet neighbor had left a paper shadow, and now everyone was trying to decide whether it belonged to a man or to a crime. In the months that followed, the appellate court issued a narrow ruling that allowed limited consideration of the notebooks, not as proof of guilt in isolation, but as context, as part of a broader pattern already established. It was a legal compromise, cautious and careful, the kind that satisfied no one completely. The defense decried it as prejudicial creep. The prosecution called it overdue. The family heard it as another step forward that still did not tell them where she was. Investigators returned to the notebooks with renewed focus, looking not just at what was written but at what was omitted. Empty pages mattered now. Gaps between entries mattered. The rhythm of the writing, bursts of detail followed by stretches of silence, suggested a life managed through control, a person who documented what he wanted remembered and left the rest to memory. Analysts mapped the entries against dates, weather, known movements, the overlay growing denser with each pass. One cluster of notes pointed again to rural properties, places outside the town's watchful eye, places that had been owned, leased, or accessed briefly and then abandoned. They revisited those places with modern tools and old patience. Drones skimmed fields at dawn, cameras reading the land for signs invisible to the naked eye. Cadaver dogs worked methodically, pausing, circling, sometimes sitting in ways that tightened throats and raised hopes, only to move on again. Soil samples were taken, catalogued, sent away. Each negative result felt like a door closing softly but firmly. The defense watched these efforts closely, ready to argue overreach, ready to claim harassment. They filed motions to limit further searches, to protect against what they called an endless investigation fueled by public pressure rather than evidence. The court split the difference, granting some requests, denying others. The process continued, narrowed but not stopped. Inside the prison, the neighbor marked the days with routines that had become ritual. He read. He exercised. He wrote letters he never sent. Those who observed him noted a change that was hard to quantify, a tension that had replaced the earlier composure, a sense of waiting that felt less strategic and more personal. He met with his attorney less frequently now, conversations shorter, more guarded. When asked about the notebooks, he said little, insisting on benign explanations, on lists and habits that meant nothing more than organization. The explanations were plausible. Plausibility had always been his refuge. Outside, the town experienced a different kind of fatigue. The case had lasted long enough to span generations, long enough for the initial shock to be replaced by a weary acceptance that some questions might never be answered. Yet the renewed activity, the quiet searches and legal maneuvers, kept reopening old wounds. People argued about whether it was time to let go or time to push harder. They argued about the neighbor, about whether decades of normalcy could outweigh a growing pile of circumstantial threads. They argued about justice itself, about whether certainty was required to move forward or whether acknowledgement could be enough. The family remained steady, their posture one of careful resolve. They attended hearings when it felt necessary, skipped them when it did not. They spoke when asked, but no longer chased attention. They had learned that hope could be preserved only by rationing it. In private, they revisited memories, piecing together the woman she had been beyond the headlines. They shared stories with grandchildren who knew her only through photographs, teaching them that absence did not erase presence. A new development emerged from an unlikely source, a financial audit. While reviewing the neighbor's historical records in preparation for a civil action related to the property searches, an investigator noticed irregular cash withdrawals clustered around key dates. The amounts were modest, easily dismissed as routine, but their timing aligned with moments of interest. The pattern suggested preparation, transactions that left little trace beyond the numbers themselves. It was not evidence of violence. It was evidence of intention. The prosecution weighed the finding carefully. On its own, it was nothing. In combination, it added texture to the picture that was forming. They consulted economists, forensic accountants, people trained to read meaning into numbers without imposing narrative. The conclusion was restrained but clear. The pattern was unusual enough to merit consideration. The defense countered swiftly, offering alternative explanations, normalizing the behavior, reminding the court that coincidence was not conspiracy. They accused the state of stacking inference upon inference, of building castles on sand. The judges listened, their questions probing but non-committal. The case advanced inch by inch. Meanwhile, the out-of-state collaboration deepened. The other detective uncovered a witness who had never come forward, a person who had moved often, stayed invisible by necessity. He remembered an encounter with the neighbor years earlier, a request for help that had seemed strange at the time, a job that involved moving heavy items at night, paid in cash, no questions asked. The witness had declined, unsettled by the insistence on secrecy. The memory had lingered, surfacing now under the weight of the Ohio case. The statement was taken under oath, corroborated where possible through travel records and contemporaneous notes the witness had kept for unrelated reasons. It did not place the missing woman anywhere specific. It did not describe a crime. It described behavior, planning, urgency, discretion. It fit the pattern. The mosaic tightened again. The appellate court allowed the statement into a supplemental record, a decision that sent ripples through both camps. The defense warned of a slippery slope. The prosecution emphasized corroboration. The family listened, their reactions muted, their expectations tempered. As winter returned, mirroring the season that had begun everything, the detective felt the familiar pull back to the street. He walked it this time, hands in pockets, breath fogging in the cold. The houses stood patient, indifferent to the weight placed upon them. He thought about how the case had taught him to read quiet as a signal rather than a comfort, to notice what did not call attention to itself. He stopped near the driveway where the missing woman's car had once sat, imagined the night again with new knowledge layered over old questions. He imagined the neighbor's house, the light patterns, the movements that might have gone unnoticed. He imagined the woman's last ordinary thoughts, the way routine can become a trap when intersected by someone else's intent. Back at the office, the case file grew again, thicker, heavier, its tabs crowded with updates that refused to resolve into a single, clean truth. The detective knew now that resolution, if it came, would not arrive as a revelation but as a reckoning, a moment when the accumulation of evidence outweighed the comfort of doubt. The law moved forward with its deliberate cadence. Motions were heard. Rulings issued. The conviction held. The sentence remained. Appeals narrowed. The neighbor's world contracted, his future defined by walls and schedules that did not care about nuance. Yet the central question, where she was, what exactly happened, remained unanswered, a hollow space at the core of everything. The town learned to live with that hollow. It adjusted its rituals, its conversations, its silences. New families moved in, old ones moved out. The story was told and retold, each time slightly altered by the teller's needs. It became less about shock and more about vigilance, a reminder embedded in local culture. Late one night, reviewing the newest materials, the detective paused over a single line in a witness statement, a phrase that echoed something from the notebooks, a shared language that could not be coincidental. He felt the slow, steady certainty that comes not from certainty at all but from convergence. The case was speaking in fragments, but it was speaking consistently. He closed the file and sat back, aware that the work was not finished, that it might never be finished in the way people hoped. But he also knew that the silence had been permanently altered. It no longer protected. It no longer soothed. It demanded attention. Outside, snow began to fall, softening edges, muting sound, the town settling into another winter. Somewhere beneath that quiet, the case continued to breathe, sustained by the stubborn refusal of those involved to accept that time alone could absolve anything. The truth, whatever shape it ultimately took, was still moving, still assembling itself from pieces that refused to stay buried, and the community, bound together by the weight of what it had endured, waited with a patience forged not by comfort, but by necessity. Spring arrived without ceremony, the kind that slips in quietly, thawing the ground before anyone agrees it's happening, and with it came a subtle shift in the case, not a breakthrough, not an announcement, but a change in posture, a sense that the past was no longer content to stay buried. The soil samples returned inconclusive, again, but one field technician flagged an anomaly, a minor disturbance pattern inconsistent with agricultural activity from the early 90s, too shallow to be a grave, too deliberate to be erosion. It sat near the edge of a property long sold, land that had passed through too many hands to remember its own history. The finding was logged, modestly, almost apologetically, but it stayed in the detective's mind like a low-frequency hum. He drove out there alone, standing at the boundary where cultivated land gave way to brush, imagining how easy it would have been to stop a car here at night, how quickly darkness could swallow motion. No markers. No witnesses. Just the sound of insects and the certainty that places remember what people try to forget. He took photographs, not because they would prove anything, but because the act of documentation felt like respect. Back in town, a different thread tightened. A retired utility worker came forward after seeing a segment about the case replayed late one evening, the kind of television watched half asleep until a familiar detail snaps you awake. He remembered a service call decades earlier, a request rerouted at the last minute, a meter inspection that didn't make sense given the account history. The address matched the neighbor's former residence. The date hovered dangerously close to the disappearance. He had thought nothing of it then. Now, he thought of it constantly. His recollection was thin, as memories often are, but it carried a specificity that mattered. The neighbor had insisted on being present, hovering, redirecting attention, asking questions that suggested a nervous energy inconsistent with routine maintenance. The worker had noticed an outbuilding, newly secured, its power recently adjusted. It had registered as odd. Odd had not been enough to report. Investigators reconstructed the service logs, confirming the visit, the timing, the adjustments made. The outbuilding no longer existed, removed years earlier during a renovation. Its absence felt louder than its presence ever had. The prosecution added the detail to their growing constellation, careful not to call it a star. The defense responded by attacking reliability, reminding everyone how memory bends under suggestion, how time erodes certainty. They presented experts who spoke calmly about false recall, about the danger of retrofitting meaning onto old impressions. Their arguments were solid. The court listened. The balance remained precarious. Inside the prison, the neighbor requested access to additional legal materials, filing handwritten motions that betrayed impatience. He argued procedural errors, constitutional concerns, anything that could widen the door even a fraction. His tone shifted between meticulous and aggrieved, a performance shaped by years of watching what worked. Those who read his filings noted a subtle change, fewer denials, more focus on process. It was as if he understood that facts were no longer the terrain he could control. The family received word of the utility worker's statement through intermediaries, the information filtered to avoid false hope. They acknowledged it with the same measured nod they had learned to give everything. In private, they debated whether it mattered. In public, they said nothing. Silence had become a language they spoke fluently. The media circled again, drawn by the accumulation rather than any single revelation. Headlines hedged, phrases carefully chosen to suggest movement without promise. The town braced itself for renewed attention, for reporters at the diner, for microphones angled toward people who just wanted to buy groceries. Some residents welcomed it, believing exposure was protection. Others resented it, tired of being defined by a wound that refused to scar over. A civil suit advanced quietly, aimed not at punishment but at discovery. Subpoenas were issued. Records surfaced. Old photographs were digitized, revealing details previously overlooked, a truck in the background, a tool leaning against a wall, a timestamp that contradicted an alibi by minutes. Minutes mattered now. They always had. The detectives spent long nights cross-referencing, building timelines that overlapped like transparent sheets, searching for moments where the layers aligned too cleanly to be chance. He marked one evening in particular, the window narrowing as new data converged. He imagined the neighbor moving through his routine, the choices made, the calculations performed in silence. He imagined how ordinary those choices might have felt to the person making them. Another witness surfaced, this one reluctant, coaxed by the promise of anonymity and the reassurance that coming forward late was still coming forward. She had been a teenager then, walking her dog, passing the neighbor's property more often than most. She remembered a night when the lights burned later than usual, a sound like metal striking metal, a smell she could not place. She remembered because it frightened her, because she ran home and locked the door. She did not remember the date. Fear had stripped the calendar away. Her statement was treated with care, corroborated only where possible, framed as atmosphere rather than assertion. It added weight without clarity, another sensation layered onto an already heavy narrative. The defense dismissed it as impressionistic. The prosecution did not disagree. As summer approached, the appellate process reached another inflection point. A judge wrote an opinion dense with footnotes, acknowledging the cumulative effect of the evidence without endorsing any single piece as definitive. The conviction stood. The sentence remained. The language left room for further action without opening the floodgates. It was law as compromise, justice as an ongoing conversation rather than a conclusion. The detective returned again to the idea of convergence, to the way independent strands began to echo each other. He thought about the notebooks, the cash withdrawals, the outbuilding, the late-night request for help, the witness memories that aligned not in detail but in direction. He thought about how cases rarely reveal themselves through confession or discovery alone, but through pressure applied over time until truth finds a seam. He spoke with younger officers, cautioning them against impatience, against the belief that resolution was a single event rather than a process. He told them that some cases end not with answers but with boundaries, with a narrowing of possibilities so tight that denial becomes untenable. He told them to respect the living as much as the dead. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the town exhaled the heat of the day, the detective stood outside the station and watched people pass, their lives moving forward in ways the missing woman's never could. He wondered what justice meant in that context, whether it was enough to know who was responsible if the how and the where remained obscured. The case file sat open on his desk later that night, a familiar weight. He added a note in the margin, not a conclusion, just an observation about pattern and persistence. He knew that tomorrow would bring more waiting, more arguments, more careful steps forward. He also knew that the silence had lost its power to intimidate. It had been broken too many times, by too many voices, each adding a fragment to a story that refused to disappear. Somewhere between certainty and doubt, the truth continued to assemble itself, imperfect, incomplete, but increasingly hard to ignore. And the town, shaped by years of unanswered questions, leaned into that space, listening for whatever came next, aware that even without a final revelation, the case had already changed them, had already taught them how fragile normalcy could be when tested by time, memory, and the relentless pressure of what does not want to stay hidden. Autumn returned with a sharper edge this time, the air carrying the faint smell of burning leaves and something else harder to name, a sense that the case was entering a narrower corridor where echoes grew louder and choices carried more weight. The detective felt it in the way meetings stretched longer, in the pauses between questions, in the careful glances exchanged when certain names were spoken. The investigation had learned how to breathe without expecting oxygen, how to move forward even when the ground refused to give. A new forensic review was authorized, limited in scope, surgical by design. Evidence that had been handled, catalogued, and recatalogued over decades was brought